The fluorescent lights hummed softly in the empty hallways of Whitmore Financial, casting long shadows across marble floors that gleamed like still water. It was barely 6 o'clock in the morning, and the building held that particular silence found only in corporate towers before the world wakes up. Marcus Cole pushed his janitorial cart down the corridor, the wheels squeaking slightly against the polished surface. His warm brown skin looked almost bronze under the fluorescent lights, and his close-cropped curls were still damp from his early morning shower. He wore the same Navy uniform he had worn for 3 years now, the company logo stitched over his heart like a small reminder of his place in the hierarchy. He was thinking about his daughter, about the breakfast he would make her before school, when a figure stepped directly into his path. Victoria Ashford stood there in last night's cocktail dress, her blonde hair slightly disheveled, her blue eyes sharp despite the shadows beneath them. She was the CEO of this company, the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Connecticut, and she was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. Her voice was quiet, but carried the weight of something urgent. "My father wants to see you, about last night. You took me to your house." The previous evening had begun with crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes, with forced laughter and calculating eyes hidden behind practiced smiles. Victoria Ashford stood in the grand ballroom of the Hartford Club, surrounded by the kind of people who measured worth in portfolios and pedigrees. She was 32 years old, had built her career through relentless competence and strategic brilliance. Yet every conversation somehow circled back to the same tired questions. "So when are you settling down, Victoria? A man needs to know his investment is protected, you understand? Your father must be eager for grandchildren by now." She smiled, the smile she had perfected over years of these gatherings, the one that showed just enough teeth to appear friendly while revealing nothing of the irritation simmering beneath. The wine helped. It always did at these events. Each glass made the comments easier to deflect, made the assumptions easier to swallow. By the third hour, she had lost count of how many times she had refilled her glass. The ballroom glittered with excess, every surface catching light and throwing it back in dazzling fragments. Victoria felt like a performer in an elaborate play, reciting lines she had memorized long ago but never believed. Her father had insisted she attend, reminding her that relationships were the foundation of business, that every handshake was an investment, that her absence would be noticed and commented upon. So she came, as she always came, dressed in a midnight blue gown that had cost more than most people made in a month. Her hair was swept up in an elegant twist that had taken her stylist an hour to perfect. She looked the part. She always looked the part. The question she could never answer was whether the part had any relationship to who she actually was. The evening wore on like a slow wound. Harrison Caldwell, a man 2 decades her senior with a reputation for hostile takeovers, both corporate and personal, cornered her near the bar. "You know, Victoria, a woman in your position really should consider the optics. People talk. An unmarried CEO, all that power with no one to share it with, makes investors nervous." She wanted to tell him that her company's stock had risen 40% under her leadership. She wanted to remind him that she had closed the Morrison acquisition while he was still fumbling through due diligence on a deal half its size. Instead, she smiled that empty smile and excused herself to find another drink. The room had grown too warm, too close. The faces around her blurred into a sea of expectation and judgment. She found herself at the bar again, ordering something stronger this time. The bartender, a young woman with kind eyes, poured without comment or question. Victoria appreciated that silence more than she could express. When the event finally ended, she refused her driver. The thought of sitting in the back of her town car, of making polite conversation with Gregory while her head spun and her pride smarted, felt unbearable. She would drive herself. She had done it before. The parking garage of her office building was closer than her home in Greenwich, and she could retrieve her own car, feel the steering wheel beneath her hands, pretend for a few minutes that she was in control of something. The underground lot was nearly empty when she arrived, her heels echoing against concrete in a rhythm that seemed to mock her unsteady gait. Her silver Mercedes waited in its reserved spot, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She fumbled in her clutch for her keys, her fingers clumsy and uncooperative. The simple act of pressing the unlock button became a challenge. She dropped the keys once, twice, 3 times. Each attempt to retrieve them sent the world tilting at angles that made her stomach lurch. She did not understand how intoxicated she had become until that moment. The wine had been flowing so steadily, so consistently, that she had lost track of her consumption entirely. Now alone in the cold silence of the parking structure, the reality of her condition crashed over her like a wave. Her hands would not stop trembling. The key fob seemed impossibly small, the buttons impossibly complex. She pressed what she thought was unlock, and heard instead the sharp chirp of the panic alarm, the sound ricocheting off concrete walls until she managed to silence it. Shame burned hot in her chest. She was Victoria Ashford. She ran a company worth billions. She had negotiated with foreign governments and emerged victorious. Yet here she stood, unable to open her own car door, swaying slightly in designer heels that suddenly felt like instruments of torture. The parking structure felt cavernous and menacing in the way that empty spaces become at night. Every shadow seemed to pulse with potential danger. The few remaining cars sat in their spots like silent witnesses, their dark windows reflecting nothing but her own distorted image. Victoria's breath came in shallow gasps as she fumbled again with the keys, her fingers refusing to cooperate with her increasingly desperate brain. The cold had begun to seep through her thin dress, raising goosebumps along her bare arms. She had left her coat at the venue, forgotten in her haste to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the party. Now she shivered in the underground chill, a tremor that had as much to do with fear as with temperature. She thought about calling her father, then immediately dismissed the idea. He would send someone. He would know. He would add this moment to his long list of reasons why she needed a husband to manage what he called her excesses. The thought of his disappointment, his barely concealed contempt, made her eyes sting with tears she refused to shed. She was better than this. She had always been better than this. But tonight, with the wine clouding her judgment and the echoes of those patronizing conversations still ringing in her ears, she did not feel better than anything. She felt small and foolish and desperately, achingly alone. Marcus had just finished his final rounds when he spotted her. The parking garage was supposed to be empty at this hour, checked and cleared before he clocked out for the night. But there she was, a woman in an expensive dress, leaning against a car that cost more than he would make in 5 years, looking utterly lost. He did not recognize her at first. The lighting was harsh and strange, and she looked so different from the composed figure he occasionally glimpsed in the elevator lobby, always surrounded by assistants and an air of untouchable authority. He saw only what was immediately apparent: a woman alone, clearly impaired, in a deserted underground structure at 2 a.m. Every instinct he had developed as a father, as a black man who understood vulnerability and danger, screamed at him that something was wrong. Marcus Cole was a 36-year-old black American man, a widower for 3 years now, father to a 7-year-old daughter named Lily, who was the center of his universe. He had come to this job not by choice, but by necessity, after his wife Maria's death had left him scrambling to find work that allowed him to be present for his daughter. The hours were strange and the pay was modest, but the job provided health insurance and flexibility, and those were currencies more valuable than prestige. He had learned to take pride in his work, in the clean floors and polished surfaces that most people never noticed, but would immediately miss if they disappeared. He had learned that dignity was not determined by title, but by effort, not by position, but by purpose. He approached slowly, keeping his distance, his voice gentle when he spoke. "Ma'am, are you all right? Do you need help calling someone?" She turned at his voice, and the movement cost her balance. She stumbled, her ankle twisting in those impossible heels, and suddenly she was falling. Marcus moved without thinking, closing the distance between them, just in time to catch her before she hit the concrete. The contact was brief, awkward, necessary. His dark brown hands steadied her by her upper arms, then immediately released, creating space between them. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the position he was in. Alone with a woman he did not know, his hands on her. No witnesses, no cameras in this section of the garage. Everything about this moment could be misinterpreted. Everything could be twisted into something ugly. The weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. He knew how these situations could be spun, how quickly a good deed could become a scandal, how easily a helping hand could be reframed as something predatory. He was a black man in a service position. She was clearly wealthy and white. The optics alone could destroy him. But even as these thoughts raced through his mind, he could not bring himself to walk away. She was swaying on her feet, her eyes unfocused, her speech slurring into incoherence. Leaving her here would be unconscionable. Whatever risks he faced paled in comparison to the danger she would be in if he simply turned his back and left her alone. She was trying to speak, but her words came out slurred and fragmented. Something about driving home, about being fine, about not needing anyone. He recognized the tone. It was the same stubborn insistence he heard from his daughter when she was exhausted but refused to admit it. "I don't think you should be driving," he said carefully. "Is there someone I can call for you? A friend, family member, anyone?" She shook her head, then winced at the motion. Her eyes, when they met his, held a mixture of embarrassment and something that looked almost like fear. Not fear of him, he realized, but fear of the situation, of being seen like this, of losing the control she so clearly valued. She mumbled something about not remembering her address, about everything looking the same, about just needing a minute. Marcus stood there in the fluorescent silence, weighing options that all seemed to carry risk. He could call building security, but that would mean involving others, creating a record, potentially exposing this woman to gossip and judgment. He could walk away, leave her to figure out her own problems, but the thought of abandoning someone so clearly vulnerable made his stomach turn. He thought about his daughter, about what he would want a stranger to do if she were ever in this situation. The answer was simple, even if the execution was complicated. He could not leave her here alone. He checked his watch. It was nearly 2:30 in the morning. No taxis would come to a corporate parking garage at this hour. Ride services meant giving a stranger access to a woman who could barely stand. Every option seemed to carry its own set of dangers. He tried one more time to get useful information from her. "Ma'am, can you tell me your address? Is there anyone I can call for you? Anyone at all?" Her response was a mumbled string of syllables that might have been words in some other context, but meant nothing to him now. Her eyes kept drifting closed, and each time she opened them again, she seemed more confused than before. The temperature in the parking structure was dropping as the night wore on, and he noticed her beginning to shiver, her bare arms covered in goosebumps. She was wearing a thin dress meant for heated ballrooms, not underground concrete caverns. If he left her here, she could develop hypothermia. If he left her here, something far worse could happen. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of internal debate, he made a decision that would change the course of his life. "I have a spare room," he said, his voice steady despite his nerves. "You can rest there until you're sober enough to get home safely. I know how this sounds. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I can't leave you here like this. It's not safe." She looked at him for a long moment, and he watched something shift in her expression. Maybe it was the exhaustion. Maybe it was the alcohol. Or maybe she saw something in his face that convinced her of his sincerity. She nodded, a small movement that carried enormous weight. He helped her to his car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a car seat in the back that seemed to reassure her somehow. He opened the passenger door, helped her settle in, then walked around to the driver's side, acutely aware of every movement he made. The drive to his home took 20 minutes through streets that were mostly empty at this hour. She fell asleep within 5 minutes, her head resting against the window, her breathing evening out into something peaceful. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind racing through every possible consequence of what he was doing. He was a single father with a daughter to protect. He worked a job that required background checks and character references. One accusation, one misunderstanding, and his entire life could crumble. Yet he could not shake the image of her standing alone in that garage, swaying, vulnerable, with no one to help. He thought about Maria, about the night she had driven home from her hospital shift, too exhausted to see straight, about the accident that had taken her from him and left Lily without a mother. Some things were worth the risk. Some responsibilities transcended self-preservation. The streets of Hartford gave way to the quieter roads of his neighborhood, where street lamps cast pools of amber light and houses sat dark and peaceful in the early morning hours. Marcus drove carefully, obeying every traffic law, checking his mirrors constantly, as if expecting pursuit. He was acutely aware of how this would look to anyone who might see them. A black man in a custodial uniform driving an expensive-looking woman through residential streets at 3 a.m. But no one was watching. The world was asleep, and for this brief window of time, he was responsible for a stranger whose name he did not even know. His house was small, a modest 2-bedroom, in a neighborhood of similar homes where people knew their neighbors and looked out for each other. He pulled into the driveway with the headlights dimmed, not wanting to wake anyone or draw attention. Inside, the house was quiet and warm, lit only by the small nightlight in the hallway that Lily insisted on keeping lit because she was scared of the dark. He guided the woman to his living room couch, moving slowly and carefully, speaking in low tones so as not to disturb his sleeping daughter. He brought a glass of water and placed it on the coffee table within her reach. He found a clean blanket in the hall closet and draped it over her gently, tucking the edges in without making contact with her body. She murmured something unintelligible and curled into the cushions. The house bore evidence of the life he had built with Maria and continued without her. Photographs on the walls showed happier times, a smiling black family at a park, Maria in her scrubs, Lily perched on Marcus's shoulders. Lily's artwork was taped to the refrigerator, and a pair of tiny pink sneakers sat by the front door. It was not a wealthy home, but it was a loved home, and that distinction mattered more to Marcus than any square footage or property value ever could. He looked at the woman on his couch, this stranger in her expensive dress, and wondered what her life was like when she was not falling apart in parking garages. She looked younger in sleep, the tension that had lined her face finally releasing its grip. Whatever pressures had driven her to drink so much, they were temporarily suspended now, replaced by the simple peace of unconsciousness. Marcus settled into the armchair across the room, positioning himself far from the couch but close enough to help if she needed anything during the night. He thought about checking on Lily, but decided against it. The risk of waking her, of having to explain why there was a stranger sleeping on their couch, felt too complicated for this hour. Instead, he sat in the darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of his own breathing and the occasional soft sounds from the woman on his couch. He did not sleep. He spent the night in a state of vigilant awareness, watching over a stranger the way he watched over his daughter, with the same protective instinct that had defined him since Maria's death. The hours passed slowly in that quiet living room. Marcus thought about the choices that had brought him to this moment, about the strange threads of fate that sometimes wove lives together in unexpected patterns. He thought about Maria, about how she would have handled the situation with the same compassion and practical kindness that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. She had been a nurse, had spent her career caring for strangers, had never turned away from someone in need. She would have done exactly what he was doing now, and somehow that thought made the weight of responsibility feel more bearable. By 5 a.m, when the first gray light began to filter through the curtains, he rose quietly and began preparing breakfast. Victoria Ashford woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of a child's laughter. For a moment she had no idea where she was. The ceiling above her was unfamiliar, lower and more textured than the smooth white expanse of her bedroom. The couch beneath her was soft but worn, nothing like the Italian leather furniture in her Greenwich home. Panic flared in her chest as fragments of the previous night began to surface. The parking garage, the trembling hands, the stranger who had offered help. She sat up quickly, her head protesting with a sharp throb of pain, and looked down at herself. Her dress was intact. Her jewelry was still in place. Nothing about her body suggested anything untoward had occurred. A glass of water sat on the coffee table untouched, alongside a neatly folded washcloth. She followed the sounds to a small kitchen where she found a scene so ordinary it felt almost surreal. A man in a plain white t-shirt stood at the stove flipping pancakes with practiced ease, while a little black girl with dark curly hair and warm brown skin sat at the table, swinging her legs and chattering about something that had happened at school. The girl noticed Victoria first, her eyes going wide with curiosity. "Daddy, there's a lady." The man turned and Victoria recognized him as the stranger from the parking garage. In the light of morning, he looked different. Younger, perhaps, with kind eyes and the sort of face that inspired trust without demanding it. The deep brown of his skin caught the soft morning light, grounding him in the space like something solid and steady. He smiled gently and nodded toward the table. "There's coffee if you want it. Pancakes will be ready in a minute. You're welcome to stay for breakfast, but no pressure." The normalcy of the offer, the complete absence of expectation or agenda, undid something in Victoria that she had not realized was wound so tight. She found herself sitting at the table, accepting a cup of coffee, watching this black, single dad serve pancakes to his daughter with the same careful attention he had shown her the night before. The little girl, whose name was Lily, peppered her with questions that Victoria answered as best she could. "Do you like unicorns? What's your favorite color? Do you have any pets?" The man, Marcus, gently redirected his daughter when the questions became too personal, but otherwise let the conversation flow naturally. There was no judgment in his eyes, no sense that he was waiting for thanks or acknowledgement. He simply cooked breakfast and cared for his daughter and treated Victoria like an unexpected but not unwelcome guest. When breakfast was finished and Lily had been sent to brush her teeth, Victoria finally found the words she had been searching for. "Thank you for everything. I know how this must have looked, how it could have been misunderstood. You took a risk bringing me here." Marcus shrugged, a simple gesture that carried no weight of martyrdom. "I have a daughter," he said. "I couldn't leave you there and live with myself." Victoria nodded, understanding more than he knew. She thought about her father, about how he would react when he learned what had happened. And he would learn. He always did. She made a decision then, sitting in that small kitchen with coffee cooling in her hands. She would tell him the truth, not because she owed him an explanation, but because Marcus deserved to be protected from any misinterpretation of his kindness. "I need to go," she said, "but my father is going to have questions. He's very protective and very powerful. I want you to know that I'll make sure he understands what actually happened." The meeting with Harold Ashford took place 3 days later in the private study of his estate in Greenwich. The room was designed to intimidate, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes that appeared never to have been opened, antique furniture polished to a mirror shine, oil paintings of ancestors who seemed to judge from their gilded frames. The air smelled of old money and older expectations. Marcus arrived in the only suit he owned, a charcoal gray number he had purchased for Maria's funeral and not worn since. He stood before the patriarch of one of Connecticut's wealthiest families and felt the full weight of the social chasm between them. Harold Ashford did not rise from his leather chair. He regarded Marcus with the sort of expression one might give a particularly confusing tax document. "So, you're the janitor who took my daughter home." The word janitor landed like an insult, though it was technically accurate. Marcus nodded. "I'm a custodial supervisor, yes." He watched the older man's lips thin with something that might have been amusement or disdain. Harold Ashford was 73 years old, a self-made billionaire who had built his fortune through real estate and ruthless efficiency. He had grown up poor in South Boston, had clawed his way to wealth through a combination of intelligence, timing, and a willingness to do whatever was necessary. He had forgotten, as the wealthy often do, that struggle did not automatically confer wisdom, that having overcome poverty did not give him insight into the lives of those still living it. He looked at Marcus and saw not a man, but a symbol of everything he had escaped, everything he had taught his daughter to avoid. What followed was not a conversation so much as an interrogation. Harold asked about Marcus's background, his education, his late wife, his financial situation. Each answer seemed to provide fresh ammunition for skepticism. a maintenance worker, a widower, a single father with a child to support on a salary that wouldn't cover the monthly wine budget of the Ashford household. Harold did not make threats, did not raise his voice, but his contempt was as clear as the afternoon sun streaming through the windows. "You understand, Mr. Cole, that my daughter is a woman of considerable means and influence. Men have taken advantage of such circumstances before." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Marcus felt anger flicker in his chest, but kept his expression neutral. "I understand that your daughter was in a vulnerable situation," he replied carefully. "I also understand that leaving her alone in a parking garage would have been unconscionable. I did what any decent person would do." Harold leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "Any decent person? That's a convenient phrase, isn't it? A man in your position, encountering a woman in hers late at night, alone. Some might call that an opportunity. Some might wonder what was going through your mind when you decided to bring her to your home rather than calling the police or her family or literally anyone else who might have been appropriate." Marcus held the older man's gaze without flinching. "Some might," he agreed, "but I'm not here to defend myself to some. I'm here because your daughter asked me to come so I could look you in the eye and tell you the truth. And the truth is that I saw someone who needed help, and I helped her. That's all there is to it." Victoria had been listening from the adjoining room, her father's study door left slightly ajar at her insistence. She heard the doubt in her father's voice, the subtle condescension that had characterized his treatment of anyone he considered beneath him. But she also heard something else, the quiet dignity in Marcus's responses, the refusal to be diminished by circumstances beyond his control. When her father began to question Marcus's motives more directly, suggesting that perhaps he had hoped to benefit from the situation, Victoria stepped through the door. Enough," she said, her voice carrying the same authority she used in boardrooms and negotiations. "This man helped me when I was incapable of helping myself. He asked for nothing in return. He didn't know who I was, and I doubt he would have cared if he did. You will not insult him in my presence." Harold's eyes widened slightly, the only indication of surprise he ever allowed himself to show. Victoria stood beside Marcus, not touching him, but close enough that her support was unmistakable. "He did what was right," she continued. "That's more than most people would do in his position, more than most people in our position would even consider." The weeks that followed the confrontation with Harold Ashford brought unexpected changes to both their lives. Victoria found herself thinking about Marcus more often than she could explain, replaying their brief conversations, remembering the warmth of his kitchen and the uncomplicated joy of his daughter's laughter. She began finding reasons to visit the lower floors of her building, timing her arrivals to coincide with the evening custodial shifts. Their conversations started small, comments about the weather, questions about Lily's progress in school, discussions about nothing in particular that somehow felt like everything. Marcus was cautious at first, acutely aware of the differences between them and the complications that could arise from any perception of impropriety. He knew what it meant to be a black man seen in certain spaces with certain people, and he had spent his life learning how to move carefully through those spaces. But Victoria was persistent in her kindness, genuine in her interest, and gradually the walls he had built began to soften. She was not what he had expected. Behind the tailored suits and corporate efficiency was a woman who laughed at terrible puns, who admitted to binge-watching cooking shows she would never attempt to recreate, who confessed that her greatest fear was not failure, but irrelevance. She asked about Maria, and he found himself sharing stories he had not spoken aloud in years. Their first date at a terrible Italian restaurant, the way she had sung off-key to the radio every morning, the hole she had left in his life that he had never quite learned to fill. Victoria listened without offering platitudes or easy comfort. She simply sat with him in the complexity of his grief, and somehow that was exactly what he needed. Lily adored her immediately, with the uncomplicated enthusiasm children reserve for people who pay genuine attention. Victoria brought her small gifts, a book about a princess who saved herself, a set of watercolors that Lily used to create masterpieces that covered the refrigerator door, Marcus found himself falling for a woman he had no business loving. He loved her sharp intelligence and her unexpected vulnerability, the way she could command a room full of executives and still feel nervous about meeting his approval. He loved that she never looked at Lily as an obstacle or a complication, but as a gift he had been trusted to protect. He loved that she never made him feel less than because of his job or his circumstances, that she saw the man he was rather than the position he held. But he also understood the impossibility of their situation. She was the daughter of a billionaire, the CEO of a company where he pushed a mop. Their relationship, if discovered, would be scandal. It would damage her reputation, threaten her position, give her enemies ammunition to use against her. He cared too much for her to be the cause of her downfall. Then the rumors began. Someone had seen Victoria leaving the building in the early morning hours, her dress rumpled, her driver conspicuously absent. Someone else had noticed her spending time on the custodial floors, engaging in conversations that lasted far longer than any interaction between a CEO and a maintenance worker should. The whispers spread through the company like wildfire, each retelling adding embellishment and innuendo. By the time the story reached the business press, it had transformed from innocent encounter into sordid affair. CEO spends night at janitor's home. The headlines wrote themselves, and none of them were kind. Harold Ashford received calls from board members expressing concern. Investors began asking pointed questions about leadership stability. Victoria's professional reputation, built over a decade of tireless work, began to crumble under the weight of speculation and scandal. Marcus watched it all unfold with growing horror. He saw the exhaustion in Victoria's eyes, the way she carried herself differently, as though bracing for the next blow. He heard the whispers when he walked through the building, felt the stares of people who had previously never noticed him at all. He wanted to protect her, to shield her from the consequences of his decision to help her that night in the parking garage. The guilt was crushing. She was suffering because he had done the right thing, because he had chosen decency over self-preservation. One evening, he found her alone in her office, staring out the window at a city that seemed determined to tear her down. He told her he would resign, that he would disappear from her life if that would make things easier. He told her that she deserved better than this, better than him, better than a man whose presence could only cause her harm. Victoria turned from the window, and her eyes held something he had never seen before. Not defeat, but determination. She crossed the room in 3 strides and took his hands in hers. I am not ashamed of you," she said, her voice fierce and unwavering. "I am not ashamed of what happened, and I refuse to pretend otherwise. You are the most decent man I have ever met, Marcus Cole. You saw a woman in trouble, and you helped her without asking for anything in return. That's not a scandal. That's integrity." She told him that she had spent her entire life trying to meet expectations that were never really about her, trying to be small enough to fit into boxes designed by people who feared her potential. She was done apologizing. She was done hiding. If the world wanted to judge her for falling in love with a good man, then the world would have to deal with the consequences. Victoria addressed the scandal directly with the same precision she brought to hostile negotiations. She called a press conference and stood before cameras and microphones and told the truth, that she had made a mistake, that she had been helped by a stranger who expected nothing in return, that she had fallen in love with a man whose character far exceeded her own. She did not ask for sympathy or understanding. She simply stated facts and let the chips fall where they may. The response was divided. Some praised her honesty, her willingness to be vulnerable in a world that rewarded only strength. Others saw it as confirmation of their worst assumptions, proof that women in power could not be trusted to maintain professional boundaries. But through it all, Marcus stood beside her, steady and unwavering, a presence that anchored her when everything else seemed to spin. Harold Ashford watched his daughter navigate the crisis with something approaching admiration. He had always underestimated her, had always seen her gender as a limitation rather than a strength. But here she was, facing down the worst kind of public scrutiny, and she was not breaking. She was not begging or apologizing or hiding behind lawyers and public relations teams. She was simply being herself, honest and fierce and completely unyielding. And the man beside her, the janitor Harold had dismissed so readily, was proving to be something unexpected. Marcus Cole did not speak to reporters. He did not sell his story or seek advantage from the attention. He simply showed up day after day, supporting Victoria without asking for recognition or reward. Harold recognized something in that constancy, something he had almost forgotten existed. Integrity without expectation. Loyalty without condition. The storm eventually passed, as all storms do. Victoria's company weathered the scandal, emerging perhaps even stronger for having faced it. Board members who had questioned her leadership found themselves impressed by her handling of the crisis. Investors who had wavered returned with renewed confidence, and Harold Ashford, in a gesture that surprised everyone, including himself, invited Marcus and Lily to Sunday dinner at the estate. It was not an apology because Harold Ashford did not apologize, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition that he had perhaps been too quick to judge. He watched Marcus at the dinner table, helping Lily cut her roast, engaging in conversation with the same quiet dignity he had displayed in that first terrible meeting. Harold realized that this man had something money could not buy, the ability to make people feel safe simply by being present. 1 year later, Victoria and Marcus married in a small ceremony in the garden of his modest home. Lily served as flower girl, scattering petals with more enthusiasm than precision, her laughter ringing through the afternoon air. The guest list was intimate, colleagues who had stood by Victoria during the crisis, neighbors who had welcomed her into their community, and Harold Ashford, who watched his daughter exchange vows with an expression that might have been mistaken for tenderness. Victoria had never looked more beautiful, not because of her dress or her flowers, but because of the unguarded joy that radiated from her face. She had spent so long performing happiness for others. This was the real thing, earned rather than inherited, chosen rather than expected. Marcus held her hands and made promises he intended to keep for the rest of his life. The years that followed were not without challenges, because no life ever is, but they faced those challenges together as partners, as equals, as parents to a little girl who grew into a young woman with her father's kindness and her stepmother's fierce intelligence. Victoria continued to run her company, but she learned to balance ambition with presence, to be home for dinner more often than not, to prioritize the small moments that make a life meaningful. Marcus eventually left his custodial position, not because he was ashamed of it, but because Victoria needed someone she trusted to manage the foundation she had created for single parents in crisis. He approached the work with the same quiet dedication he brought to everything, building something meaningful from the ground up. Harold Ashford bounced grandchildren on his knee and discovered late in life that there were forms of wealth he had never bothered to count. Victoria sometimes thought about that night in the parking garage, about the woman she had been, controlled by expectations defined by achievements, measuring her worth in stock prices and quarterly reports. She thought about how close she had come to losing everything because she could not admit to needing help, how the walls she had built to protect herself had nearly become her prison. And she thought about Marcus, about the simple courage it had taken for him to approach a stranger, to offer assistance without agenda, to bring her into his home and trust that she would understand. He had seen her at her worst and responded with kindness. That was not a common thing. That was not a small thing. That was everything. Marcus had learned something too. In the years since that fateful night, he had learned that responsibility was not the same as martyrdom, that caring for others did not require abandoning yourself. He had learned that love could come from unexpected places, that second chances were not just possible, but sometimes necessary. He had learned that his daughter deserved to see her father happy, to understand that grief did not have to be a permanent state, that moving forward was not the same as forgetting. Maria would always be part of their story, a chapter that ended too soon but shaped everything that followed. But she would have wanted this for him, wanted him to find joy again, wanted Lily to have a mother figure who chose them deliberately and loved them unconditionally. On quiet evenings when Lily was asleep and the house was still, Victoria and Marcus would sit on the porch of the home they had built together, watching fireflies dance in the summer darkness. They did not need to fill the silence with words. They had learned to be comfortable in each other's presence, to find peace in proximity, to understand that love was not always about grand gestures, but about showing up day after day, choosing each other again and again. Sometimes Lily would join them, no longer the little girl who had asked about unicorns, but a teenager with opinions and dreams and the quiet confidence that came from knowing she was loved. They would sit together, three people who had become family not through obligation, but through choice, and they would watch the stars emerge from the darkening sky. The message of their story was simple, though it had taken them both a long time to learn it. A trustworthy man is not defined by his bank account or his job title, not by the car he drives or the house he owns. A trustworthy man is defined by what he does when no one is watching, by the choices he makes when there is nothing to gain and everything to lose. Marcus Cole had been that man in a parking garage at 2 a.m, offering help to a stranger who had no claim on his compassion. He had been that man when he brought her to his home, when he protected her reputation before his own, when he stood beside her through scandal and judgment and doubt. That quiet integrity had changed both their lives, had proven that goodness still existed in a world that often seemed determined to deny it. And in the end, that was the only legacy that mattered. Not wealth or power or achievement, but the simple truth that one act of kindness, offered without expectation, could change everything.